Hello everyone, my name is Jess, and in today's video I'm going to share a complete overview of how to read sewing patterns. I know that when you're first starting out it can be super overwhelming, especially with the number of growing independent designers, bloggers, and self-publishers. So as you begin to read sewing patterns, you'll notice that each designer formats their patterns differently. So from the general cover and instructions layout, to using photos or illustrations for the steps or none at all. And also the sewing techniques between the different designers tend to vary. However, one tip is that the sewing terminology is pretty much the same across the board, so you'll be able to pick up on certain terms and that'll help with the familiarity with the instructions. There are so many talented designers out there who are consistently refining their techniques and sharing their knowledge, which makes the sewing community such an exciting place to be. So I'm going to break apart a pattern to make it really easy to understand so you can get started with sewing. So let's start by looking at the cover of the pattern. So on the front cover, you'll notice a photo or illustration of the final project. Sometimes there are different options shown if the pattern includes multiple styles. You'll also find the name of the pattern. So for different patterns, it's located on different areas. And usually there's a short description on the pattern about what the pattern entails or just a general style description of the pattern. You can usually find the designer logo on the front cover or the company branding style. So that way it's really recognizable, the brand pattern that you're using. If you like this certain designer, then you can look for the brand name or their logo on the pattern when you go to purchase more of their patterns. So I encourage you to really look at the design itself for what it is. So you may not like the colors of the fabrics that the designer chose for the cover photo of the project. So just remember that you can use your own colors and your own fabrics and customize it to your own personal style. So I'm going to turn all of these patterns over to the back side. So you can take a closer look. So on the back of the pattern, sometimes the designer will include additional photos or illustrations detailing out the different views or options of the pattern itself. You can also locate the sizing information. This is usually on the back side of the cover. Sometimes it's on the front, but it'll say the finished size of the pattern. Sometimes there are multiple sizes included in the pattern as well. So for garment patterns, you'll need to measure your body or the person that you're making it for to figure out the size that you want to make. And the finished dimensions are the dimensions after sewing. So that doesn't include any seam allowances. It's the measurements of the completed project. Also, usually listed on the back of the pattern are the features featured in the pattern or a short description so you can anticipate what's all involved or what's inside the pattern itself. And after reading the features, you can kind of gauge if those will accommodate your needs and the style that you're looking for. With all kinds of unique fabrics available on the market today, it's more and more common for designers to include recommended fabrics on the back of the pattern cover. So for each fabric type will be a detailed list of recommendations or suggestions for the different types of fabrics. So this is also very common on apparel and quilting designs and bag designs. From there, you'll notice that there's a list of materials and supplies needed for the pattern. So you can reference all the different supplies and fabrics. It'll tell you the amount of yardage that you'll need. And sometimes there's also a list of helpful notions. So that part is key. If a pattern is recommending certain notions, you'll likely want to have those on hand. So that way it makes the pattern a lot easier to sew and super helpful for the techniques that are inside. Oftentimes the notions list gets overlooked and sometimes a pattern requires a unique tool that you won't have in your stash. So make sure to look for those. Another thing that is great for beginners to look out for is the difficulty ranking. So not all patterns have this, but some patterns will let you know the skill level or the amount of sewing knowledge or experience needed to create the pattern. So for Sally Tomato patterns, we have all of our testers complete the instructions and give us an idea of their ranking from beginner to expert. And then we note it on the back of the pattern so then you know how easy it is depending on the features that are inside. Another thing that you might be able to find on the back of the pattern are details about the fabrics that were used in the cover photos. So it'll list out the name and the manufacturer. So if you like the designs and the fabric on the front, then sometimes the designer will include them on the back. And lastly, there's usually some information that is necessary for stores or copyright information, the barcode. So those things are usually pretty standard that you can find on the back cover of a pattern. So I'm going to open up our Sally Tomato pattern, and inside you'll find a packet of sewing instructions, and usually there's a separate packet with the pattern pieces. So this particular quilt pattern only has an instructional packet. However, this bag pattern has a set of sewing instructions as a booklet, and then it has a separate packet of all of the pattern pieces. On the instructions, you'll find some general information in addition to helpful information about the pattern, such as seam allowance and a list of pieces to cut for the pattern, and then it'll start into your sewing instructions. At the beginning of some patterns, it will have a cutting layout. Our patterns reference a cutting layout that we add onto the end of the instructions. So you can see your pieces all laid out on fabric, so that way you get the best use out of your fabric. And make sure that your pieces are positioned in the correct direction in accordance to grain line, and also the print usually goes horizontally. And usually the print is repeated starting at the bottom, selvage up towards the top. So you'll want to position the width of the pieces so that way your print is the correct direction on each piece. So the cutting layouts are super helpful. At the beginning of an apparel pattern, there may be general sewing instructions for common apparel techniques. Usually apparel patterns will have descriptions of sewing terms within the pattern and explanation of any pattern symbols and fabric keys to know before you begin. If you missed my previous video on basic sewing terms, definitely take a few minutes to watch that so you're familiar with common words and tools that may be used in your pattern. At this point, it's a great idea to read through the entire set of instructions. And that will be super helpful, so then when you do start the project, some of the steps will sound familiar, and perhaps you can even anticipate the next step, so that way you're more comfortable with the process. If you're using a PDF pattern, make sure to print the pattern at 100% scale or actual size, so that way it prints the correct size if there are any pattern pieces included. So then you can start by cutting out the paper pattern pieces. So usually the pattern will instruct on how to cut out your pattern pieces, but generally you'll just cut along the solid lines directly with your scissors. You can cut out the paper pattern so you have a copy. Otherwise, some people like to use tracing paper. You'll lay it on top of the pattern page and then use either a pencil or a marker and trace the outer edges. Make sure if you trace your pattern pieces, you transfer any cutting instructions, pattern symbols, and placement marks. Also, be leery of some markers because they could bleed through the tracing paper and then leave marks on your original pattern. So that's a great tip if you want to preserve your original pattern. Otherwise, if the pieces are on a standard sheet of paper, you could always scan it at your home or local library at 100% or actual size to maintain the correct size of the pattern piece, and then just print out a photocopy. You'll definitely want to watch the video that debuted yesterday on how to prepare your fabrics before you begin any cutting. And also, tomorrow we'll be releasing another video which will explain my top tips and recommendations for cutting out your fabrics. Also, you'll want to reference any cutting layouts that are possibly included with the pattern to get the best use of your fabric and to make sure that the print is facing the correct direction. So once you have all of your pieces cut out, you'll move on to the sewing instructions, and you'll take those one section and one step at a time. But until then, have a great rest of your day, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking the button below so you get notified when a new video releases. I hope to see you soon. Bye.